Velkith had learned a long time ago that the safest thing to do was look away. And that lesson had kept him alive on Nexus Station 47 for 3 long years now. Because looking away meant surviving, and surviving meant everything to a Sithrani clerk who had nothing else left in the galaxy. The station hung in the cold darkness of neutral space. A massive spinning wheel of metal and lights where dozens of species came together to trade and deal, and sometimes to hurt each other when nobody important was watching. And Velkith watched more than most because his species had 4 eyes and photographic memory that made forgetting impossible, even when forgetting would have been a mercy. He worked in the Cargo Manifest office on level 7, a small room filled with old screens and the smell of recycled air. And every day he walked the same path from his sleeping pod to his workstation. And every day he saw the same things happening in the corridors, and every day he pretended not to see them at all. The Krethful ran this section of the station the way predators run a hunting ground. And everyone knew it and everyone accepted it, because the alternative was pain or worse. And the station security officers looked the other way, because looking the other way was easier than dying. And so the cycle continued day after day after day. There were 3 of them today. The same 3 that always worked this corridor during the morning shift. Massive creatures with gray skin like stone and tusks that curved up from their lower jaws like weapons made of bone. And Velkith recognized them immediately as he rounded the corner on his way to work. Grath was the leader, the biggest of the 3, with scars on his face that told stories of violence Velkith never wanted to hear. And behind him stood Tosk and Brennel, slightly smaller but no less dangerous, their eyes scanning the corridor for prey. The way hunters scan the tall grass, they had found someone today. And Velketh's 4 hearts began to beat faster when he saw who it Mikos was a Pelori, one of the avian species from the inner systems. And he was perhaps the most fragile being on the entire station, with hollow bones that could snap like dry twigs and feathers that had long ago lost their shine from too many years of hard work and harder treatment. And he worked the sanitation detail because it was the only job nobody else wanted. Pelori stood barely half the height of the Krethfalum surrounding him, his wings pressed flat against his back in a gesture of submission that Velkith recognized from his own mirror. And his large dark eyes were wide with the kind of fear that comes from knowing exactly what is about to happen and being completely unable to stop it. You owe payment. Grath growled, his voice like rocks grinding together in the belly of a dying ship. And he leaned down toward the small avian with breath that probably smelled of rotting meat and cruelty. Protection payment is due, and you have not paid, and that makes me very unhappy. Mikos trembled, his thin legs barely holding him upright. And when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that Velkith had to strain all 4 ears to hear it across the corridor. I do not have it. The Pelori whispered. The sanitation pay was cut again, and I barely have enough for food, and I'm sorry, but I cannot give what I do not have. Grath smiled. And it was the kind of smile that held no warmth at all. Only the promise of violence wrapped in the thin disguise of amusement. Then you pay another way, the Krethfalum said. And his massive hand shot out and grabbed Mikos by the throat, lifting the small avian off his feet and slamming him against the metal wall of the corridor with a sound that echoed through the empty space like a warning bell. Velkith stopped walking and pressed himself against the opposite wall, making himself as small as possible, which was a skill every Sithrani learned before they could walk. And he watched with 2 of his eyes while the other 2 scanned for escape routes that he knew he would never use. Tosk and Brennel moved in closer, blocking any possible rescue that would never come anyway. And Grath held Mikos against the wall with one hand while raising the other into a fist the size of the Pelori's entire skull. This is what happens to those who do not pay, Grath announced to the corridor. to the hidden watchers he knew were there, to the universe that had long ago stopped caring about justice. Let everyone see and let everyone remember. There were others in the corridor now. Velkith realized, beings who had stopped on their way to work or their way home, but beings who stood frozen like statues of flesh and bone and cowardice. And not one of them moved to help, because helping meant becoming the next victim, and nobody wanted that. The Sith Rani felt shame burning in his chest like acid. Shame for his own fear, and shame for his entire species, and shame for every time he had looked away when looking was what was needed. But the shame was not strong enough to overcome the terror that had been programmed into his genes by a million years of being prey on a world where predators ruled everything. Grath pulled his fist back, muscles coiling like springs made of hatred and power. And Mikos closed his eyes and made a small sound that might have been a prayer to whatever gods the Pelori believed in. And Velkith prepared to look away as he always did. As everyone always did, but then something unexpected happened. Something that would change everything. Velkith thought he knew about the galaxy and the beings who lived in it. There was a human on the station. Velth had seen him arrive 3 days ago. A creature from one of the outer worlds that the Galactic Council classified as a Category 4 Death World, which meant that simply surviving there was considered an achievement worthy of note, and the human had kept to himself mostly, working on his damaged ship in the lower docking bays and speaking to few people and causing no trouble at all. His name was Cole. Or at least that was what the cargo manifest said. And he was unremarkable by almost any standard that Velketh could think of. Not particularly tall for his species, and not particularly muscular either, with gray in his short beard and lines on his face that spoke of years and experiences that the Sith Rani could not begin to imagine. Rounded the corner, carrying a heavy crate of ship parts, his eyes forward and his attention seemingly on his own business. And Velkith expected him to do what everyone else did, to see the scene and lower his gaze and walk past as quickly as possible. But the human stopped, and the human looked, and something changed in the human's face. Something cold and dark and ancient that made Velkith's 4 hearts skip beats in a way that fear had never managed to accomplish. The human sat down, his crate with a gentleness that seemed wrong for what was about to happen. And then he began to walk toward the Krethvaloon with steps that were steady and sure, and absolutely without fear. And Velkith realized that for the first time in 3 years on this station, something was finally different. Nobody had warned the Krethvaloon about humans, and as Grath's fist began its deadly journey toward Mikos' fragile skull, Velkith found that he could not look away, not this time. Not when something new was finally happening in a universe that had seemed so hopelessly fixed in its cruelty. The human called Cole was about to teach the entire station a lesson that none of them would ever forget. The fist was already moving when the human reached them, a massive gray hammer of bone and muscle that could crush a Pelori skull like an eggshell under a boot. And Grath was grinning with the pleasure of violence that some beings seemed to carry in their blood like a disease. Cole did not shout a warning or make any sound at all. And that silence was perhaps the most terrifying thing about what happened next. Because when most beings enter a fight, they scream or roar or make some noise to announce their intentions. But this human moved like water flowing over stone. Quiet and natural and completely unstoppable, he crossed the remaining distance in 3 strides. And then his hand shot out and wrapped around Grath's massive fist. And the fist stopped moving, as if it had struck an invisible wall made of pure will and determination. The sound of impact echoed through the corridor, flesh meeting flesh. And then there was nothing but silence as every being in that space tried to understand what they had just witnessed. Grath's fist had stopped, and the human was holding it in place with one hand, his fingers wrapped around knuckles that were each the size of his own eyes. And the Krethval's arm was trembling with effort as he tried to complete the punch that should have ended a life. "What is this?" Grath snarled, confusion and rage mixing in his voice like poison in water. And he stared down at the human who was nearly half his size and who should have been easy to crush. "Who are you to interfere with syndicate business?" Cole did not answer immediately, and when he did speak, his voice was low and calm and somehow more frightening than any roar could have been. "Let him go." 3 words, spoken without anger or fear or anything that Velkith could recognize as emotion. And yet those 3 words carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the corridor. Like gravity itself had increased around this one small human. Grath tried to pull his fist free and could not. And Velkith watched the Krethvol's expression change from confusion to something that might have been the beginning of fear, though the massive creature would never have admitted such a thing. "You dare?" Grath spat, and his other hand released Mikos, who slid down the wall and collapsed on the floor in a heap of feathers and terror. "You dare to touch a Krethvolume warrior?" The human glanced down at Mikos, just for a moment, and something flickered in his eyes that Velkith would later describe as a kind of cold calculation. The look of a being who was measuring distances and angles and probabilities faster than any computer could process. "I dare," Cole said simply. Tosk and Brennel had been frozen in surprise, but now they moved, their training kicking in as they realized that their leader was in trouble. And Tosk pulled a curved blade from his belt, while Brennel activated a shock baton that crackled with enough electricity to stop a charging beast in its tracks. Velkith wanted to warn the human, wanted to shout that he was outnumbered and outweighed, and that no being could stand against 3 Krethvolume warriors and survive. But his voice was locked in his throat, and his legs would not move, and he could only watch as the scene unfolded before him. Cole released Grath's fist and stepped back. And for a moment, Velkith thought the human had come to his senses and was going to retreat. But then he saw the way Cole positioned his feet, and the way his hands came up in a stance that spoke of training and experience and something darker beneath the surface. Tosk attacked first, the blade slashing toward Cole's throat in an arc that should have ended the fight before it truly began. But the human was not where the blade expected him to be, having moved at the last possible moment with a speed that seemed impossible for a species that the galactic files listed as moderate threat level. Cole caught Tosk's wrist as the blade passed, twisted in a motion that looked almost gentle, and there was a sound like dry wood snapping that made Velkith wince. And then Tosk was screaming and dropping to his knees with his wrist bent at an angle. That wrists were never meant to bend. Brennel came in with the shock baton, aiming for Cole's back while he was occupied with Tosk. And the human did something that Velkith would replay in his memory 1,000 times, trying to understand. He grabbed the falling Tosk and spun, using the Krethvol's massive body as a shield. And the shock baton struck Tosk instead of Cole. And the electricity that was meant to disable one enemy instead took 2 out of the fight at once. Grath roared and charged, all pretense of cunning abandoned in favor of raw fury. His massive arms spread wide to grab and crush this tiny creature who had humiliated his warriors. But Cole ducked under the grasping arms and drove his fist into a spot just below Grath's ribs. And the Krethvol's roar became a wheeze as something vital was struck with precision. Another blow followed, and another, each one landing in places that Velkith would later learn were nerve clusters and vulnerable joints and gaps in the Krethvol's natural armor that no one outside their own species should have known about. And Grath fell to his knees with his eyes bulging and his lungs fighting for air that would not come. The whole thing had lasted 11 seconds. And Velkith knew this because his species kept time unconsciously, a biological clock that ticked in their minds like a heartbeat. And 11 seconds was barely enough time to take a breath, and yet it had been enough time for one human to defeat 3 Krethvolume warriors. Cole stood in the center of the corridor, not even breathing hard, and he looked down at the 3 groaning bodies around him with an expression that held no victory or pride, only a kind of tired acceptance. as if this was simply something that had needed to be done, and now it was finished. Then he turned to Mikos. And Velkith watched the cold warrior vanish as if it had never existed, replaced by something softer and more careful. And Cole knelt beside the trembling Pelori with movements that were slow and gentle and completely opposite to the violence of moments before. "Are you hurt?" the human asked, and his voice was different now too. Warm in a way that made Velketh think of safe places and protective parents and things he had not thought about in many years. Mikos could not speak, his beak opening and closing without sound, and so Cole simply began to check him over. Those deadly hands now moving with the care of a healer as they examined wings and limbs and the delicate bones that made up the Pelori form. "Nothing broken," Cole said after a moment. "You are going to be all right." Velkith finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper that he was not even sure the human could hear. "How did you do that?" Cole looked up, and for the first time he seemed to notice the crowd that had gathered to watch, the beings who had stood frozen while he fought alone. And his expression did not change, but something in his eyes acknowledged their presence. "I did what needed to be done," the human said. "That is all," and then he helped Mikos to his feet, supporting the small avian with one arm, and began to walk down the corridor as if nothing unusual had happened at all, leaving behind 3 defeated warriors and a crowd of witnesses who would carry this moment with them for the rest of their lives. Velk watched him go, and felt something stirring in his chest that he had not felt in years. Something that might have been hope or might have been the first small flame of courage beginning to catch. The next 3 days on Nexus Station 47 were different from any days that Velkith had experienced in his time there, charged with a strange energy that seemed to hum through the recycled air like electricity before a storm. And everywhere he went, he heard whispers about the human who had done the impossible. The Krethvolume Syndicate was not known for forgiveness, and everyone on the station knew that what had happened in that corridor was not the end of something, but the beginning. A first move in a game that could only end in blood and pain for someone. And most beings expected that someone to be the human called Kalevilith found himself watching for the human everywhere he went, looking for him in the crowds and the corridors and the common areas, where beings gathered to eat and drink and pretend that the universe was not as cruel as they all knew it to be. And he was not the only one watching, because the entire station seemed to have developed a sudden interest in this stranger from a death world who had dared to stand up to the untouchable. He found Cole in a repair bay on the lower levels, working on a ship that looked as tired and worn as its captain, with patches on the hull and scorch marks near the engines and a name painted on the side that Velketh could not read because it was in a human language he did not know. The human was alone, bent over an open panel with tools in his hands and grease on his fingers. And he looked up when Velketh approached, but did not stop working, as if visitors were something that happened often and required no special attention. "You are still here," Velketh said. And even he was surprised by the words that came out of his mouth. Words that sounded almost like an accusation, though that was not what he meant at all. Cole nodded without looking up from his work, his hands moving with the same precision that had disabled 3 Krethvolume warriors in 11 seconds. "My ship is not fixed yet," the human said simply. "I cannot leave until she can fly." Velketh stepped closer, his forearms wrapped around his narrow body in a gesture of nervousness that his species had never been able to hide. And he watched the human work for a moment before speaking again. "They will come for you," the Sithrani said. "The Syndicate does not forget, and they do not forgive. And they will make an example of you to show everyone what happens when someone stands against them." Cole set down his tool and looked at Velkith with eyes that held neither fear nor concern, just a kind of patient attention that made the clerk feel like he was being truly seen for the first time in years. "I know," the human said. "Then why do you stay?" Velkith asked, and he could hear the confusion in his own voice. The inability to understand a choice that went against every survival instinct that evolution had built into his species. You could find transport off the station tonight and be gone before they organized their response. Cole was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke his voice was softer than before, carrying something that might have been sadness or might have been wisdom earned through pain. If I run now, what happens to the beings who watched? The human asked. What happens to you and to Mikos and to everyone else who saw what I did and who the syndicate might decide was part of it somehow? Velkith had not thought of that, had not considered that his mere presence in that corridor could make him a target. And the realization sent a chill through his four hearts that had nothing to do with the temperature of the repair bay. They would not blame us, the Sithrani said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were a lie. A comfortable fiction that beings told themselves to avoid facing ugly truths. They would, Cole said, and he picked up his tool and returned to his work. That is how bullies work, everywhere in the universe. Whether they have tusks or not, they punish those who witness their humiliation, because it reminds them that their power is not as absolute as they want it to be. Velkith stood in silence, processing this information, and he found himself looking at the human with new eyes, seeing not just a warrior who could fight, but a being who understood the deeper workings of cruelty and chose to position himself against it. Your species, Velkith said slowly. The galactic files say you come from a death world, a place where everything tries to kill you from the moment you are born until the moment you die. And yet you risk yourself for strangers who cannot help you in return. Cole smiled for the first time, and it changed his face in ways that Velkith had not expected, softening the hard lines and making him look almost gentle. Humans are complicated, the human said. We can be the most selfish creatures in the universe when we choose to be, taking and destroying and caring nothing for the damage we leave behind. But we can also be something else, something that my people call good. Though that word does not translate well into most galactic languages. Good, Velkith repeated, tasting the word like it was food he had never tried before. What does it mean to be good? Cole thought about this for a moment, his hands still working on the ship's systems, even as his mind worked on the question. It means looking at the universe and seeing all the suffering and cruelty and injustice that exists, the human said, and choosing to add something different instead, something that helps rather than hurts, something that protects rather than preys. Velkith felt something shifting inside himself, something that had been sleeping for a very long time, and he recognized it now as the thing that had died when he first learned to look away. The thing that made beings want to stand up even when standing up was dangerous. I want to help, the Sithrani said. And the words surprised him even as he spoke them, coming from a place he had forgotten existed. I do not know how to fight like you do, and I am not brave like you are, but I want to do something. Cole stopped working and looked at Velkith with an expression that held something like respect. Something that the clerk had not seen directed at himself in longer than he could remember. Fighting is not the only way to make a difference, the human said. You work in the cargo manifest office, yes? You see things. You record things. You know the patterns of this station better than most. Velkith nodded, not understanding where this was going but listening with all four of his ears. The syndicate operates because no one reports them, because everyone is too afraid to document what they do and send that documentation to the authorities who could actually stop them, Cole said. But if someone were to start keeping records, gathering evidence, building a case that could be transmitted to the Galactic Regulatory Authority, the Sithrani felt his eyes widen as he understood what the human was suggesting. A way to fight that did not require fists or weapons, but only the courage to see and to remember, and to tell the truth. I have a photographic memory, Velkith said slowly. I remember everything I see, Every transaction and every shipment and every being who comes and goes from this station. Cole nodded, and his smile widened just a little. Then you are exactly what this station needs, the human said. Someone who remembers when everyone else chooses to forget. Velkith left the repair bay that evening with something new burning in his chest. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. A purpose that felt strange and frightening and absolutely right. And he did not know yet what price he would pay for this choice, but he knew that he was willing to pay it. The Sithrani clerk, who had spent 3 years looking away, was finally learning to look. And that was perhaps the most dangerous thing that had happened on Nexus Station 47 in a very long time. Word spread through the station like fire through dry grass, moving from deck to deck and species to species, carried in whispers and glances and the subtle signals that oppressed beings learn to use when speaking openly is too dangerous. And Velkith found that he was not alone, and his awakening Mekos came to him first. The small Pelori appearing at his workstation one evening with feathers, still not quite smooth from the trauma of his near-death experience. And he spoke in a voice that trembled, but did not break. I want to help, the avian said. The human saved my life, and I have nothing to give him in return except my eyes and my courage, which I thought I had lost, but which I find returning now like blood to a limb that has been tied off too long. Velkith welcomed him, and together they began the work of recording, of documenting, of building the case that could bring down the syndicate, if only they could survive long enough to complete Ida. Chelkin dockworker named Thrask joined them next, a being covered in thick scales that made him look dangerous, but whose heart was soft in ways that the galaxy had punished him for again and again. And he brought with him access to shipping records that showed the syndicate smuggling operations in perfect detail. Then came Senna, a Varnathi merchant who had lost her business partner to syndicate violence 2 years ago, and who had been waiting ever since for a chance to strike back without getting herself killed. And she brought credits and connections and a burning anger that had refined itself into something cold and useful. They met in secret, in maintenance tunnels and storage rooms, and the forgotten spaces between decks where surveillance did not reach. And they built their rebellion piece by piece, while the station continued to spin in its endless orbit around a dying star. Cole continued to work on his ship during the day, visible to everyone, a target walking in plain sight. And Velkith understood now that this was deliberate, that the human was drawing attention to himself so that the real work could happen in the shadows, where no one thought to look. The syndicate was gathering its forces, and everyone knew it, and the tension on the station grew thicker with each passing day until it felt like the very air was ready to explode at the smallest sparkfell. Keth transmitted his first report to the Galactic Regulatory Authority on a 5th day, a package of data and evidence that documented 17 separate crimes and named 12 syndicate members as responsible. And when he sent it, he felt a terror unlike anything he had experienced before. But underneath the terror was something else, something that felt like freedom. They were no longer just surviving, they were fighting back. And even if they lost, they would have done something more than simply wait for the end. Cole found him that evening, appearing in the cargo manifest office without warning, and the human looked tired in a way that Velkith had not seen before. The lines on his face deeper, and the gray in his beard more noticeable. They are coming tomorrow, Cole said without greeting, without explanation, as if continuing a conversation that had never paused. 12 of them, full combat gear, ordered by the syndicate leadership to make a public example that will remind everyone on this station what happens to those who resist. Velkith felt his heart race, but forced himself to stay calm, to think clearly, to be the being he had chosen to become, rather than the coward he had been for so long. How do you know this? The Sithrani asked. Because I have been making myself an obvious target, Cole replied. And because I know how beings like them think. They cannot allow the humiliation to stand any longer. and tomorrow is the day they have chosen to end it. Velkith looked at the human, really looked at him, and saw for the first time the weariness beneath the strength. The cost of being the one who stands when everyone else sits down. You cannot fight 12 of them, the clerk said. Even you have limits, Cole smiled, but it was a sad smile. The smile of someone who has accepted an outcome and made peace with it. No, the human admitted. I probably cannot, but that was never the point. Then what was the point? Velkith demanded, feeling anger rise in his chest at the thought that this being who had given him hope might be planning to throw his life away for nothing. The point was to show you that it could be done, Cole said. To show you and Mikos and Thrask and Senna and everyone else on this station that standing up is possible. That the Syndicate's power is not absolute. That fear is a choice, and you can choose differently. Velkith stared at the human, understanding dawning in his mind, like a sun rising over a world that had known only night. You never planned to survive this. The Sithrani whispered. I plan to make a difference, Cole corrected. Survival would be nice, but it was never the priority. The priority was waking up this station, giving you something to build on. Showing you that one being can change everything if they are willing to pay the price. Velkith stood up from his desk, all 4 of his arms shaking with emotion, and he did something that he had never done before in his entire life. No, he said. Cole raised an eyebrow. Surprised for the first time since Velkith had known him. No? The human repeated. You are not doing this alone, Velkith said. And his voice was stronger than it had ever been. You showed us how to stand up. But that does not mean you get to fall alone while we watch from the shadows. That is not what you taught us. That is not what any of this means. Cole opened his mouth to argue. But Velkith was already moving past him, already heading for the door, already thinking of Mikos and Thrask and Senna, and all the others who had found their courage in the shadow of this strange human from a death world. Where are you going? Cole called after him. Velkith paused at the door and looked back. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt like himself. Like the being he had been before the universe taught him to be afraid. To remind everyone on this station that you are not the only one who can choose to stand. The Sithrani said, You gave us something human, and we're not going to waste it by letting you die alone. He left before Cole could respond, moving through the corridors with purpose, and behind him the human stood in the empty cargo office, a smile spreading across his tired face that held something that might have been pride. The peaks. Next 12 hours would determine everything. And Velkith intended to spend every minute of them building an army of beings who had finally remembered what it meant to be brave. The maintenance bay was cold and quiet when the 12 Kreth-Valoom warriors arrived, their boots echoing on the metal floor like the drums of war. And Cole stood among the scattered parts of his half-repaired ship with a wrench in his hand and no fear on his face. Grath led them, his wrist still bandaged from their first encounter, his eyes burning with a hatred that had been fed and nurtured for days until it had become something almost holy in its intensity. And behind him stood 11 warriors in full combat armor, each one carrying weapons that could tear through steel like paper. Human, Grath growled, the word sounding like a curse in his mouth. You should have run when you had the chance, but your arrogance has made you stay. And now you will die slowly while everyone watches. And they will learn that the Syndicate is not to be challenged. Cole set down his wrench carefully, taking his time, showing no urgency despite the death that surrounded him on all sides. I thought about running, the human admitted. But then I realized something important about this station, about the beings who live here, about what they need more than they need safety. What is that? Grath asked, genuinely curious despite himself. They need to see that the Syndicate can lose, Cole said simply. And you have given them that gift by bringing so many warriors for just one human. Grath laughed, and his warriors laughed with him. The sound harsh and cruel, and absolutely certain of victory. "There is no army coming to save you," the Crethvalum leader said. "We have watched every approach, every corridor, every possible path of rescue. And there is nothing but us and you and the lesson you are about to become." Cole smiled. And something in that smile made Grath's laughter die in his throat. "I did not call for an army," the human said. "I did not need to." The sound came from behind the cargo stacks, dozens of feet moving in unison. And Grath spun to see something that his mind refused to accept at first, because it was simply too impossible to be real. They came from everywhere at once, emerging from between containers and dropping from maintenance hatches, and stepping out of shadows that had hidden them until this very moment. And they were not warriors, not fighters, not trained soldiers of any kind. They were the weak ones, the prey species, the beings who had spent years bowing their heads and looking away, and accepting cruelty as the natural order of the universe of elves, stood at the front of them, his forearms trembling but his spine straight. And beside him was Mikos with his fragile bones and damaged feathers, and Thrask with his soft heart hidden beneath his scales, and Senna with her cold anger finally finding its purpose. Behind them stood dozens more. Sanitation workers and cargo handlers and shop clerks and all the invisible beings who kept the station running while the syndicate fed on their fear. And in their hands they carried tools and pipes and anything else that could serve as a weapon. "What is this?" Grath demanded, spinning to face this unexpected threat. "This is what happens when you push too hard for too long," Velkis said. And his voice carried through the maintenance bay like it had never carried before. "This is what happens when beings who have been afraid finally find something that makes them more afraid of staying silent than of speaking up." The Crethvalum warriors looked uncertain for the first time, their weapons ready, but their confidence shaken by the sheer number of beings surrounding them. And Grath's face twisted with rage and confusion as he tried to understand how his moment of triumph had turned into this. "You are fools," the syndicate leader snarled. "We will kill all of you, and the station will learn an even greater lesson than we planned." "Perhaps," Cole said, stepping forward to stand beside Velkith. "But you will not do it quietly, and you will not do it without cost. And by the time you finish, there will be no one left on this station who fears you, because fear requires hope, and you will have taken that away." A sound cut through the tension, a familiar chime that echoed through the station's speakers. And then a voice that Velkith recognized as the station's automated announcement system. "Attention all personnel. Galactic Regulatory Authority enforcement vessel has docked at Base 17. All syndicate members are ordered to surrender immediately pending investigation of crimes documented in reports submitted by station residents." Grath's face went pale, a feat that Velkith had not thought possible for a Crethvalum. And the warrior's eyes darted to Cole with sudden understanding. "You," Grath breathed, "this was never about fighting us. This was about distracting us while you called for help." "No," Cole said, and he nodded toward Velkith. "This was about giving them time to build a case, to document your crimes, to find the courage to stand together and demand something better." The doors to the maintenance bay opened, and beings in the gray uniforms of the Galactic Regulatory Authority streamed through, their weapons trained on the Crethvalum warriors, who now found themselves surrounded by both an armed crowd and actual law enforcement. Grath looked at his warriors, looked at the authority officers, looked at the massive station residents who had finally found their voice. And something broke behind his eyes, the understanding that power built on fear crumbles the moment fear becomes less terrifying than the alternative. "This is not over," the syndicate leader said as the authority officers moved in to disarm his warriors. "No," Velkith agreed, "but it is beginning, which is more than this station has had in years." The arrests took hours, and Velkith watched them all, recording everything with his perfect memory, building a record that would ensure this day was never forgotten. And when it was finally done, he found Cole at his ship, loading the last of his supplies for departure. "You are leaving," the Sithrani said. "Not a question, but a statement of fact. My ship is fixed," Cole replied. "And there are other stations, other places where beings are afraid. Other bullies who need to learn that their power is not absolute." Velkith nodded, understanding in a way he could not have understood a week ago. "Why did you do it?" he asked, the question he had wanted to ask since that first moment in the corridor. "You did not know us. You had no obligation to us. You could have walked past and been safe." Cole considered the question as he sealed the last cargo hatch. And when he finally answered, his voice was soft with something that might have been memory or might have been hope. "Where I come from. There is an old saying," the human said. "The only thing necessary for evil to win is for good people to do nothing. And I have spent my whole life trying to be a person who does something, even when it is hard, even when it hurts, even when the cost is more than I want to pay." He turned to face Velkith, and the Sithrani saw in his eyes the weight of all the stations and all the battles and all the beings this human had helped along the way. "But the truth is simpler than that," Cole continued. "I saw someone who needed help, and I was there. And I had the ability to act, and so I did. Because that is what beings should do for each other. That is what I believe the universe asks of us." Velkith reached out with one of his 4 hands and clasped the human's arm, a gesture of respect that his species reserved for those they considered family. "Thank you," the Sithrani said, "for teaching us to stand." Cole smiled, warm and tired and genuine, and he returned the clasp before climbing the ramp to his ship. "You always knew how to stand," the human called back. "You just forgot for a while." The ship lifted off 10 minutes later, rising through the docking bay and disappearing into the endless black. And Velkith watched it go with all 4 of his eyes, knowing that he would never forget this human, never forget this week, never forget the lesson that had changed everything. He returned to his desk in the cargo manifest office. But he sat differently now, straighter, more alert, more present in the world around him. And when a new group of enforcers tried to set up a protection operation on Level 3 the next month, Velkith did not look away. He organized a response instead, rallied the beings who had stood together once before, and reminded them all of what a single human had taught an entire station. Sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person willing to step in. And once you learn that lesson, you never have to unlearn it again.